Right. Hello. Today I wanted to talk about this new book just released 123 years ago. Dracula is a thing that was and existed for a long, long time, and now is the perfect time to talk about it because I like being irrelevant. Okay, so I know it's kind of funny again to summarize a book that everybody must have read, but let's just quickly talk about what the book is actually about. The book follows a cast of characters, but we start with Jonathan Harker, who is this young solicitor, and he arrives to a castle in Transylvania that is owned by Count Dracula. And Jonathan is there to basically help him with some real estate business. The Count is planning to move to London, so he bought some property, and that's basically the reason for Jonathan to be there. And at first, Jonathan is charmed by his host. Count Dracula is described as being very articulate and very interesting, conversation partner, etc. And it's kind of funny because the modern image of a vampire is this like sexy bad boy, but Count Dracula is described as this mustached old dude with like really red lips. As time goes on and Jonathan stays in this castle, he starts to realize that something really weird is going on. There are no servants, everything seems to be like in disrepair and boarded closed. And also, at some point, Jonathan realizes that he can't leave, that every time he tries to leave, the Count invents some reason for him to stay. And obviously, that raises some suspicions, and Jonathan starts to afraid for his life and suspect that the Count might be some evil being or, a vampire, because we all know that's what the book's about. Just as an aside, the book is an epistolary novel. Basically means that it's a collection of documents, diary entries, letters, telegrams, even some newspaper clippings, and stuff like that. The whole beginning of the book is Jonathan's diary. And then as we go further into the book, we are introduced to several other characters through, again, their writings and diaries and letters. The other characters being Mina, Jonathan's fiancée, her friend Lucy, and Lucy's three suitors. I guess they'll propose to her at some point. And they all describe in their writings all the weird things that are happening and their encounter with Count Dracula and their struggle to defeat this evil entity. Basically, that's the whole plot. So let's just start with the characters. Overall, I felt they were kind of bland. I don't know, I just didn't find them particularly memorable. Somewhere at the end of the book, there was a character mentioned that I actually forgot who he was. I had to go back and read his introduction again to remind me who he is, which is not a good sign. It just means the characters are not very interesting. And at first I thought to myself, well, it's just the age of the book showing, maybe that's just the style. They just didn't care about fleshing out these characters. But then there are many books, old books like Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice, where characters are really leaping off the page. So I guess that shouldn't be an excuse for a book to have bad characters. Female characters were a bit ridiculous as well. There was basically one main female character in the book, Mina, Jonathan's fiancée. She was basically described as the embodiment of all good, almost an angel, a god-sent creature on earth. She's so smart that she's actually described at one point as having a man brain, which made me laugh. She's brave and pious, the most perfect creature you could imagine. It kind of made me think of, a TV show or a movie where they have a bunch of male characters and only one female character. So they don't want to offend anyone, so they make the female character like super amazing, which makes her also super bland and unbelievable, which is kind of funny. Apparently the same problem existed in fiction 100 years ago. Aside from the characters, I did enjoy the style of the book. I haven't read many books where it's a collection of writings from different characters. I guess you could argue that when you read a book from multiple points of view, it's kind of like just reading diary entries from different characters. But then the inclusion of letters and telegrams and newspaper articles and stuff like that definitely makes it feel like you're the one investigating this sequence of events. So that was definitely a fun style to dip my toes into, and I would definitely read more books of the similar nature in the future. And I know there's modern examples of similar style, and I definitely really want to check them out. When it comes to pacing, I felt like the first half of the book was definitely stronger than the second. The first one I did read quite quickly, but then somewhere in the middle, everything kind of screeched to a stop for me. It took me more than a month to finish that second half, and at some points I had to read in like a few pages a day, which is not ideal. It's not something I like to do. Yeah, the tension building in the first half is just so much more effective, and I think it's kind of because of one specific event. And now I'm gonna go into spoilers. If anyone cares about 123-year spoilers, here's your spoiler warning. There is this character, Lucy. She's bitten and she falls under Count Dracula's spell. The other characters try very hard to keep her alive, but they don't realize she's been visited by a vampire and she's under this sort of mind-controlling thing. And it takes them ages to figure it out, but in the end, just as they realize what's happening, they're too late and she dies. This whole section, as they're trying to work through the problem and they're doing all these things to try and keep her alive and to try to snap her out of this mind control thing, I found really interesting and engaging, and that's what kept the pacing and the tension up for me. But then, after Lucy dies, the exact same thing happens to Mina. And even though she has the exact same symptoms as Lucy did, and they saw Lucy as a vampire, they saw her rise from the grave and bite people, it takes them ages to figure out what's happening to Mina. And it's interesting, but we just went through all of this. And second, because Mina was established as this like embodiment of goodness, I kind of didn't have any doubt about her surviving. So for me, there was no tension in this whole situation. And it took me ages to get through that second half. And also the second half does feel like retracing the same ground, basically. There are so many things happening in a very repetitive manner. Like there are multiple scenes of the characters breaking into houses, multiple scenes of the characters re-explaining stuff to each other and reconvincing each other. And it felt like after Lucy dies, the conclusion should have come much quicker. So I think that's about it. Those are my thoughts on Dracula. It's alright overall. I didn't find it particularly amazing. It had an interesting writing style. It had very bland characters. It had a very poorly paced plot, in my opinion. Do I recommend this book to anyone? I don't know, I guess. It's interesting. I wouldn't put it on books you must read before you die, but if you're interested in vampire fiction history, if you're kind of curious about that time period, if you're curious about epistolary novels and you want to try this genre, if you're trying to read some classics, yeah, sure, why not? It's not very long. Well, it's about 500 pages. I guess it is long actually, now that I think about it. Okay, so one more thing. I always thought of Dracula as the first book of vampire fiction, so I was willing to kind of ignore the kind of slow pacing and a bunch of re-explaining of the same things of like what exactly is a vampire and how vampires work and stuff like that, because I thought, well, this is the first time we actually encountered the modern version of a vampire, so it makes sense that they have to explain it in such detail. But then I did some googling and apparently it wasn't. There were a whole bunch of books about vampires, including a serialized story called Varney the Vampire. I'm not making this up. That's its name. I laughed so hard when I found that. So there were a whole bunch of vampire books before Dracula, and they themselves were based on a lot of like folklore about vampires. So I guess Dracula is just the one that got popular, and apparently it wasn't even popular when it came out. Like it was, but it wasn't considered a classic. It gained its like widespread popularity only when it started being adapted into different versions, like plays and later movies. That's when its cult status emerged, apparently. It's not the first one, it's not the first one to come up with a lot of ideas. It's just the one that got lucky and got popular. And apparently there were a lot of really interesting books in 18th and 19th century about vampires. There was this one called Carmilla about a lesbian vampire. There was one called Vampire City, which had vampires that glow in the dark, I think. Just all sorts of things. So I think I might do some research into this and maybe find some of these books and read them and maybe do a little video on different vampire books before Dracula. I am kind of curious, so I guess we'll see if I manage to actually get through some of these books, because I have been struggling with some of the older books just with the writing style. English is not my first language, so you can probably hear by the accent. So sometimes when I read an older book, it's a bit harder for me to understand what's happening and catch the meaning of some words, because, you know, with time, expressions and words change, and sometimes it's just hard to understand what the hell's going on and what the characters are talking about. Anyway, I'm rambling. That's it. Thanks for watching if anyone is watching. Goodbye.